Welcome to Microdose Psychedelic Insights, powered by the Conscious Fund. This is the PsyFi series, discovering the cutting-edge science and research in psychedelic medicine.
All right, welcome back, everybody. This is the PsyFi podcast, where we talk to leading clinicians, researchers, scientists, and industry experts to unravel the mystery that is psychedelic science. And I'm here today with the psychedelic scientist himself, Manesh Girn. Thank you so much for joining us, man. I appreciate you being on our show today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Excited to chat.
Yeah, absolutely. For our audience, I'd love if you could just share a little bit about who you are and what kind of drew you to the psychedelic space.
For sure. So I'll talk about what I am right now. I'm a Neuroscience PhD student over at McGill University. I do a bunch of different things, but one of my main projects right now is studying the so-called default mode network, which is a particular network in the brain that's involved in kind of abstract aspects of our thinking, you could say. And so I study that, and I also do stuff related to psychedelics. So I have a couple of collaborations with some leading researchers, including Robin Carhart-Harris over at Imperial College London, also Chris Timmerman at the Imperial College, kind of working with them on their data sets where they have brain data from LSD, psilocybin, and DMT. And I'm basically kind of working with that, trying to analyze it in new ways to understand what's going on. And so that's what I'm doing right now. And in terms of my path getting here, so, I had a long-standing interest in psychedelics since I was a teenager. I think it first started when I was like 16, 17. I got introduced to Zen Buddhism through a high school teacher. And then, from there, I was interested in this concept of enlightenment, of meditation, of kind of changing how we perceive reality and all these things. And one way or another, this took me to some books on psychedelics. And then I was like, here are these compounds which are so stigmatized in our culture, which can catalyze these experiences where we transcend beyond our ego and sense this like unitive oneness with all the world and, change how we perceive reality so radically. And I was like, this is fascinating. And then so I ended up studying, my undergrad was mainly in psychology, philosophy, and neuroscience, a bit of computer science. And I was like, I want to study psychedelic drugs in the brain. And here I am.
Wow, dude, what a journey. That's really fascinating. There's so many interesting parallels because, I'm a scientist as well. And so I think that's so cool. You're working with these leading researchers, these pioneers in the field like Robin Carhart-Harris. And I think it's even more fascinating the intersection of spirituality, meditation, and these other practices and how they're really in alignment, and hand in hand. They go hand in hand with psychedelic drugs.
Totally.
That's a really, really fascinating element to it. I'd love if you could speak a little bit about that and how and I know institutions like Harvard are doing a lot of research into meditation and things like yoga and breathing. And there's some interesting parallels as to what happens in the brain, with psychedelic compounds and practices like meditation. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. I think our audience would find it really interesting.
Totally. Yeah, it's super fascinating. And one way we could think about it is this concept of kind of lessening or reducing our attachment to our ego, to our sense of self, to our kind of stories that we tell ourselves about how the world is and who we are. Because we go about our day, we don't control what thoughts we have. They just come up in our head and we have the decision or choice to take them seriously or not. And the default, kind of way of being for people is like, oh, I had a thought and it must be important. It must be real. It must point to something that's substantial. And something you realize with meditation and also psychedelics is that not really. These are just like things that are appearing in your experience. And, they don't really have any more importance than what you give them. And I think, if you meditate and you're practicing mindfulness, the whole idea there is you're trying to allow your thoughts, feelings, emotions to come and go without getting caught up in them kind of automatically. And it's like having a space where it's like, oh, I'm having this thought or feeling. I'm going to decide whether I act on that or whether I give it my attention. And I think that gives you the power to kind of step out of our concepts and our models of the world and kind of see them from a looser perspective or more provisionally and kind of have a wider view on things. And then, with psychedelics, what they do is they kind of how I understand them and how some researchers are understanding them is to dissolve like our fundamental kind of structures of our experience. So like our beliefs around how the world is or who we are start to break down, and now all of a sudden, you're having a lot of crazy experiences where your chair might be dissolving into something, or your sense of being a particular type of person with this identity and history is kind of fading away, and you're just like, oh, what am I now? What's left? And through that, you start to see your own personality, your own thoughts, your own tendencies and behaving as just something you're watching. It's you cultivate that distance between you and it, and you find that with meditation and psychedelics. And on the brain level, we know that psychedelics and meditation both act on the default mode network. They act on a lot of other things as well, and I think it's very complex what happens in both these states. But one thing that both do, which is interesting, is they seem to reduce or kind of, you could say, disorganize or disintegrate activity in the default mode network. And the default mode network, as I mentioned before a bit, is like a network. One way to broadly understand it is it's like it corresponds to anything that relies on memory. So if you're trying to remember the past, imagine the future, that's a default mode network. If you're trying to, conceptually reason about something or reason about somebody else's beliefs, that's the default mode network. If you see something as being you, is corresponding to self or not self, that's a default mode network. And basically this becomes less activated or disorganized, meaning that the strength of our concepts and memories is reduced, and we have a more kind of open perspective on experience. And I think, as I've said, like at a both psychological, cognitive, and brain level, it seems to be happening both these things. So
that's so cool. I think that's really fascinating because the way you describe what happens or the functions of the default mode network, it seems like you're using it whenever you're doing something that's not being present in this moment.
Exactly.
If you're in the future or the past, you're identifying with yourself and your ego. And so it's so interesting that that's what gets dissolved through both meditation and yoga, and then also psychedelics, and a really fascinating analogy I once heard is what psychedelics do to the brain is kind of what society experienced when Galileo realized the Earth wasn't at the center of the universe. It takes away activity from their prefrontal cortex, and it takes away that ego identification, and it's like, oh wait, I'm a part of something greater, just like it increases areas in these other parts of the brain, the midbrain and other areas, instead of just the prefrontal cortex. And so dude, that's really fascinating. The default mode network is something Paul Stamets talks a lot about, and a lot of people, psilocybin researchers. If you could talk a little bit more about how psilocybin affects the default mode network. And I know we have a mushroom conference coming up in November, and we're going to be talking a lot about it, so it would be cool to get a little taste of it now.
Yeah, for sure. So, it's funny, the connection between the default mode network and psychedelics first was originated from a paper with psilocybin. The paper was in 2012. And in that paper and in subsequent ones, the kind of story that's there is that the default mode network, becomes less active, and becomes less connected within itself. And that moreover, certain connections within the default mode network are associated specifically with ego dissolution. And so, as I said before, what we call the default mode network is actually a set of brain regions. You could say, let's say 12 or 13 of them, in some ways of looking at it, that are interconnected with each other. And so when you're characterizing default mode network, you're looking at the individual connections between 15, let's say 13 regions. So that's 13 by 13 connections that are there, right? And so there's a lot of ways to look at that. And studies with psilocybin have shown that the kind of, you could think, one way to think about it is that the reduction in the connections between a certain area of the brain called the hippocampus and another area of the brain called the posterior cingulate cortex, or actually it's more so the hippocampus with the rest of the default mode network in general. So this is a region, the hippocampus is involved in memory, right? It's involved in our memories of past experiences mainly, which is called episodic memory in the research. And so and you could think about it, these memories of your past experiences are what kind of give you a sense of being a person who exists in time. It's like, I remember my experiences yesterday and 10 years ago. I also kind of remember or project my memories into the future. And this is how I think I'm going to be. And so basically in psilocybin state, the hippocampus becomes less connected to the rest of the brain or the rest of the cortex, and the rest of the default mode network as well. And this relates to ego dissolution, which makes a lot of sense because you're kind of severing that connection between to your past experiences, which kind of ground your sense of being an individual self. And what's also interesting with psilocybin is that the hippocampus also becomes more dynamic in its activity. There's more variance or variability in its activity patterns. And so it's an interesting thing where the default mode network becomes kind of less active and disintegrated, and the hippocampus becomes more disconnected, but also more crazy in its activity. And so we still need to look into more what that means, but it is related to ego dissolution and the sense of having your identity dissolve and you kind of lose all attachment to concepts and experiences from your past. So.
That's really cool. It sounds like these concepts of dissolution and disintegration and death, old concepts of old ideas, is so fundamental to the psychedelic experience and its therapeutic potential, especially with mental health, and the body of research has really grown. And I'd love to know, and I'm sure our listeners would as well, what your typical day looks like and maybe a little bit more about your research. Are you conducting them on animals? Are they human trials that you're working with now? Are they purely data analytics at the moment? Please share. For
sure. So yeah, now it is mainly data analytics for me. It is extremely hard to collect data with psychedelics, as any company knows when they're trying to get in that space. It's not easy. There's a lot of hoops you got to jump through, a lot of regulations and etc. And in the research world, we have these hardcore ethics boards as well, which you have to get through. And so,
absolutely.
So my kind of thing right now, I'm a graduate student, right? So I'm trying to do as much research as I can with data that's available elsewhere. For example, I'm using data from London with Robin Carhart-Harris. I'm using their already collected data, analyzing in new ways because it's accessible, right? And then, after I'm done here, I'll probably work with Robin and actually conduct my own research with him. So we've chatted about that. And anyway, so right now, my day-to-day looks like this, I have the data and I'm trying to analyze it in new ways. Also reading a lot of the literature these days, trying to find out kind of new ways to understand psychedelics and the serotonin 2A receptor and how to link all these things together, such that when I do finish my PhD and then presumably I'll very likely go work with Robin, I'll have lots of ideas on actual ground level studies to do. But now, it would, honestly, if I were to try to do it for graduate school, it will take maybe at least a year or 2 years just to set it up. And then basically I'm out of here in 3 years. So,
Yeah, no, I absolutely can respect that, man. I understand how long and tedious and intensive that process is. My last publication that we talked about with the repeat lung transplantation was a data analytics sort of project too, looking at old transplant records, and it's intense. It's very intense, but it definitely, when done properly, can provide really great insight. And I hope that as we move forward, the restrictions will become a lot more lax and we'll be able to do a lot of the research that everyone is so eager to see, in this space. So since you started your PhD and since your fascination with psychedelics as a teenager, how have you seen the research landscape and the science landscape around these drugs shift, and where do you hope to see it go in the future?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it shifted a lot, right? Even the last few years with, I think Michael Pollan's book was a huge boost to the awareness of this and respectability of it, right?
Yeah.
And now it's everywhere, these companies are Compass had their IPO and they had a lot of people interested, and a lot of people are aware of the space and keeping an eye on it these days, And when I first started, undergrad, which wasn't that long ago, I guess it was 2013. It was much less, it was more mysterious. It was still mysterious. It was still stigmatized. People weren't really kind of respecting the scientific potential behind them. And then fast forward, now it's crazy how there's so many public, back in then too, I remember, in second year of undergrad or something, I was I want to look at all the psychedelic research in the last 10 years. And literally, it's a dozen papers or something, And now it's I'm taken aback by how much stuff is just out there. And there's these huge psychedelic conferences with, dozens and dozens of speakers who are doing research and across the world, and it's insane, right? And it's only getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah,
So
in June or July, there was 264 clinical trials ongoing, involving investigating the use of psychedelic compounds. So huge difference, right?
Yeah, it's insane. I think 2020 will be the decade of the psychedelics. I honestly think, they're gonna make huge changes in psychiatry and kind of necessitate an overhaul of approaches to the treatment of a lot of disorders. And I think I'm super excited for that, and I'm really excited to play a part in both. Like for me, I see my role is like having a deeper understanding of how they work and what's going on in the brain. What are the mechanisms at play? What allows psychedelics to create personal transformation or catalyze personal transformation in these these kind of states of consciousness. And I think there's so many interesting aspects to the research, and it's going to expand and grow. And yeah, I'm just like super stoked.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it too. I know that a lot of people in the industry are, and you can't help but notice there's so many parallels to cannabis, and how cannabis kind of set the regulatory framework. And you could also observe how public perceptions sort of shifted around drugs, psychoactive drugs in general, plant medicine, entheogenic plants. Cannabis has had a big role. At the same token, psychedelics are very different, because we have a much deeper understanding of the serotonin receptor. And a lot of these compounds, at least when isolated, fit the single molecule paradigm better than something like cannabis, where we're not having quite the same luck taking just THC or just CBD out of context, versus taking synthetic psilocybin out of context seems to still be pretty effective. So that's a really interesting contrast, I think it'd be interesting from a scientific perspective and a pharmacological one if you could talk about those differences a little more. Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I think it's called the entourage effect, right? It's like, what are all the other compounds that come along with it? And I think it's a thing definitely for natural psychedelics, and of course cannabis. That's a major thing.
Right.
But like stuff like you can make the argument, and people do. There are a lot of purists out there who are saying, like, actual mushrooms is always better than the synthetic, man-made one. And I think part of that is just like non-scientific, right? It's just like and fair, right? Everyone can have their own way of conceiving these substances. But I think there are, people. I'm not like an expert, but like I know there are additional compounds within the psilocybin mushrooms that
like a mycological entourage effect. Sorry to interrupt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And they can like synergize with the psilocybin itself, or have enzymes that help with absorption, and there can be a variety of things in these things, right? I think that could vary from species of mushroom to species of mushroom. So I think there is a difference between taking it that way and taking it synthetically. But it's like, is that a huge clinically relevant one? And people would often disagree on that as well. And I think, and also with stuff like ayahuasca, for example, which is you're basically, you're taking two different plants, one of which reduces the activity of an enzyme that allows the other to be absorbed, and stuff like that. I feel like, and then also, there's also many compounds in that, in addition to DMT and the enzyme inhibitor, monoamine oxidase inhibitor. There's a lot more in that. So I think the extent to which the entourage effect matters for a psychedelic, it'll vary across compounds. And especially with psilocybin, it's unclear, just how important that is. And for example, I know there's a lot of underground therapists who combine psilocybin with Syrian rue. And Syrian rue is like a monoamine oxidase inhibitor as well, like a natural one. And apparently that enhances the experience and makes it more therapeutically powerful. And that's like, a lot of people say that, And so there's a lot of cool research to be done on these things, and it's very unclear, but there's definitely something there to look into.
Yeah, I've been hearing more and more about the use of MAOI with psilocybin. I know some cultures use cacao, which has weak MAOI activity, or exactly pairing it with Syrian rue. And these combinations are super fascinating, right? Because we're still trying to understand their individual activity. But then we're combining them with, for example, other functional mushrooms and edible mushrooms like lion's mane, the Stamets stack, and things of that nature can really it's like a whole really groundbreaking development, you know, as far as nutraceuticals, pharmaceuticals, and everything goes. But you're right, there's more than two, but there's definitely two fundamental schools of thought when it comes to the medicalization of psychedelics and the injection of capital into the space. And there are people that fall all over the spectrum, you know. But I guess I'm of the mind that I want this medicine, of course, in a safe, ethical, and responsible way to reach as many people as possible. And I believe that's possible through medicalization. I'm curious what your thoughts and opinions are on this as a scientist working in the space.
Yeah, totally. I think so too, right? I think having it available for mental health professionals to give to clients or patients who need it is huge, right? The main concern in my mind is, for-profit companies driving up the price more than is necessary, you know? Because there's the idea that, maybe standard treatments with antidepressant, let's say, cost, I don't know, $8,000, let's say, a month. I have no clue how much they actually cost, but let's say they cost that much. Now, let's say with psilocybin, you can do the therapy for $2,000, but you're like, oh, these other standard treatments are $8,000, so we're going to charge $6,000, you know? And whereas like the totally ethical, I just want to help people, I don't care about profits, would give it for the $2,000, you know what I mean?
Right.
And so my concern is making them kind of this excluding like lower income individuals, for example, and it's unclear how much insurance will cover these things, right?
Right.
So my main concern about medicalization is accessibility to kind of minorities and underserved populations and people with lower socioeconomic status. So that's a lot of my concern. I think a lot of people share that too.
Yeah.
But I think the path forward right now is medicalization, and that's the best way to have it accepted in a widespread way, and also kind of available. And then also what I hope is that as it becomes more people undergo psychedelic therapy, it becomes clear how these can enhance the lives of normal people, because they can definitely, there's like, of course, helping people and healing their disorders is huge. But that's just the beginning. That's getting them to baseline, so then they can experience expansion and growth beyond their normal self, you know? And I think that's really exciting too. And it's just, in my mind, it's a process of getting there. So I think medicalization is the first step, but it's not the last step.
Dude, that's great, because I think that's the stark contrast that's not recognized enough by policymakers between psychedelics and cannabis. You know, so when we're talking about recreation or non-clinical use, we're talking about psychospiritual growth. We're talking about the next step in human evolution. You know, we're not talking about getting stoned and watching a movie on your couch. Like it's just not the same thing. It's not what's happening. You know, even if you were to take a bunch and sit in your couch, like things are going to happen to you, you know, that are out of the ordinary and out of your ordinary experience. And then conjoining that, or doing that in conjunction with psychotherapy with really trained and competent clinicians can really open up a new world for a lot of people, and a paradigm of treatment and recovery that people can get excited about. You know, it's not like you're already in a bad place if you are depressed and if you're suffering from drug addiction, you know, and it's not like the current treatment paradigm or models are super appealing. It's not like, oh man, I'm in this position, I can't wait to go to rehab, you know. But what if it was like, oh, there's this really great life waiting for me over there, and it's like, this is unfortunate where I am now, but now that, you know, I can access the tools to really change things for me and go beyond baseline, like you said, you know, beyond just surviving into thriving. I think that's huge, and something that we're all really excited about, you know. But you bring up some good points about accessibility and inclusion, social equity, and these are a lot of discussions that are happening in the cannabis space right now as well. You know, and there was an interesting article in the Washington Post, I believe I just read, that talked about, as these compounds become medicalized, how will they become more accessible? But also the fact that the clinical research isn't representative of the entire world's population. And as a matter of fact, a lot of it's only been done on pretty affluent and mostly white people, you know. Like technically as a scientist, you understand then that like you can't just extrapolate these results and assume that they'll work the same in everybody. So how can we bridge this clinical education and research gap?
Yeah, it's super interesting. I think, kind of what comes up for me for this question is the concept of kind of social cultural uses of psychedelics and ritual settings. Because a lot of this medicalization, it pitches itself as kind of culturally neutral, if that's even possible. It's
Yeah.
like, here's the scientific thing, but the thing is, the whole medicalization approach is its own socio-cultural context, and
Yeah.
it could be the case for people of different cultures. They want more of a religious, spiritual overtone to it, and that's how they're going to heal, because they need that, because that's their belief system. And I think being sensitive to the diverse social cultural context that these compounds have been used, and also the demands or requirements or expectations of different cultures, is huge for having that more general, greater generalizability. Because if you're like a secular, atheist dude in New York, the type of experience which might be the most palatable and helpful to you is going to be different than somebody, I don't know, a Tibetan Buddhist in Nepal or something, and there's so much variability in what they would want from the experience or how they would conceptualize it, And I feel like a concern there is, like, if we create this mass marketable thing, it's going to be imposing a particular view on people who might not like it. And I feel like that might reduce efficacy in certain populations. And so this is why I think, the whole anthropological social sciences side is actually very important for psychedelics and important with important implications for therapy and clinical approaches.
That's so fundamental, man. It's so important, because you're right. We can't continue to move forward and not pay heed and give credence to where these compounds came from, and the fact that the way they were indigenously and traditionally used since time immemorial are kind of, they give us a lot of insight to the best practices and how to use them now. Like, for example, with iboga and ibogaine treatment, used for opioid addiction, used for a lot of addictions, but primarily opioid addiction because it alleviates the withdrawals. That's a very long process. One of the things that came up in my mind when we talked about accessibility and cost is like, right, the treatments may not be terribly expensive. Where the cost goes up is the facility, and then having a trained therapist to sit there with you for 8 hours, right? Or whatever the time might be while you're tripping, right? That requires someone with the ultimate compassion and skill set and training to be able to handle anything and keep you comfortable while you're in that state, So I think it's really fascinating, because with this context of iboga, like, there is definitely a need for training people, to become more aligned with and in tune with the way that these indigenous cultures were using these medicines. Because back in the day, when they gave, or the Gabonese and the Bwiti tribe would give iboga to someone as part of their coming of age ceremony, the whole village would give that person a lot of time and attention over the next few days. So this is the context that these things come from. It's not like, sometimes they get a little. I have some skepticism too, where it's like, we can't just take these, pharmaceuticalize them, put them in a bottle, and give them to people. Maybe on a microdose level, but even then, Third Wave, for example, just came out with this microdosing course, and it talks a lot about intention and talking about the window of neuroplasticity, people learning languages and expanding businesses and stuff, when they're taking these compounds. So it's a very different paradigm and structure to the way we're used to taking drugs. So I think you're right. It really speaks to the best practices a lot. I don't know if you have another idea or comment to share on that.
No, I think it's just so important. Like, I could, what this is reminding me of too is like the tendency to see them as just another psychiatric drug, right? And I know there was you probably know it better than me. There was a company that was trying to introduce psychedelics without the experience, right? Do you know who it was?
I think MindMed is trying to do that now with 18MC, their iboga derivative. But this is a practice that's trying to be picked up by a lot of drug developers in the space now. It being viewed at, and the argument is like, look, microdosing has all these benefits, and that's supposed to be sub-perceptual. So maybe we don't necessarily need the hallucinatory experience. And maybe a part of me as a scientist is like, am I just associating this really powerful hallucination, which also happens to happen at the same time I'm taking this compound? And then maybe that's not necessarily like an easy or an obvious, parallel to draw. Because like there could be other factors, there could be physiological things that are happening. So that's that side of that train of thinking, But then again, LSD is only LSD, and it's in micrograms, and if it's blowing your world to the point you're not an addict or an alcoholic anymore, you got to question there's the hallucinations and the spiritual mystical experiences might have a role, in their therapeutic efficacy.
Yeah, I personally really do think so. Obviously, there's both things going on. There's the biochemical side, which it increases neurogenesis, increases neuroplasticity, creates a number of changes in your brain dynamics and your chemistry. But I think, I personally think the experience is so central, and the studies out there have shown this over and over again, that the quality of the acute experience is what predicts clinical outcomes, right? It's not just like an input-output mechanism like Prozac, you take it, and then afterwards you feel a bit better. Except Prozac's not even that fast. It'll take like a month or something.
Yeah, right. A month and maybe you'll feel better.
Yeah, exactly. While also having your experience of life change a lot in a negative way. But I think, with psychedelics, I feel like the people who are trying to develop a way to do it without the experience are missing the point. It's like the point is to have kind of transformative insight into your patterns and change your perspective on life. And that I really believe that, maybe it has to be a conscious process, but whether it has to or not, I think it should be a conscious process. You should be conscious of that transition into a new way of perceiving your life, It's like, well, I would want to just take a pill and close my eyes and wake up and I have a new view on life again, even if it's better. It's like, I don't want that,
I think that's such a great way you put it, especially when it comes to something like iboga. Like the article I read yesterday was really fascinating because it talks about how iboga is not going to be the answer to the opioid crisis. It's a strong catalyst, but that's the problem. The problem is we just think we're going to take the next pill or the next psychedelic experience on its own is just going to make us all better, we don't have to do any work. And it's like, no, the great thing about psychedelics is if you meet them halfway, then powerful things can happen. But if you just take it and expect it to do the work for you, then I see where there's some disappointment then, and there's some, skepticism. But no, I think all in all, unlike something like cannabis, in a similar vein to cannabis, a lot of these have very safe therapeutic indexes and safety profiles. Of course, there's some heart issues with iboga in some patients, but for the most part, something like psilocybin is very safe. If you take a very high dose of psilocybin, you won't die, but you will for sure have a earth-shattering psychedelic experience, So it's really fascinating what the discussion is going on now about the role the hallucinations may or may not play, and the whole aspect of microdosing, I think, brings an interesting element to that discussion. When we are talking about pharmaceuticalization of these compounds, I think it's interesting. You can't help but think about things like abuse potential, and people. For example, I think Paul Stamets put niacin in his stack, and he talked about this at the psilocybin summit as well. So if you were to try and take too many to achieve a psychedelic experience from this microdosing formulation or nootropic or nutraceutical, you'd have the niacin flush and you'd get very, very uncomfortable. So there are some abuse-proof mechanisms that they're trying to put into place, and I think that's really fascinating as well. But I think it's interesting to get your insight on the whole idea of these compounds being psychoactive, there being a lot of them being Schedule 1 still, and how to reframe the narrative around their addiction and the fact that these are psychoactive drugs, but they're not the same. They're not the same as things like alcohol or cocaine or heroin. Not to what they do in the brain, not to what they do to us as a society. So if you could talk a little bit about that, I think it'd be cool.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they're so much different, right? Because things like cocaine, alcohol, and heroin are just in my opinion, they're all terrible drugs that have stronger potential for dependence and potential for adverse effects on your life, and I think psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, DMT / ayahuasca are minimally neurotoxic. Like there'd be comparisons drawn to like aspirin or something.
Yeah.
And and you could take huge doses of these things and not have lasting, physiological damage to your brain or anything like this. And at the same time, they're not physically. You can't get a physical dependence on them. You can't be addicted to them the same way. And like people, you can get psychologically dependent on them, but also their tolerance precludes your ability to use it very often anyway, because it takes a few days at least. And most people, after having an intense psilocybin experience, don't want to do that again for a bit.
Right.
This experience itself is not conducive for a constant use. Right. And so I think, what's important to recognize is that with these compounds, with psychedelics, it's like set and setting are so important, right? It's like, what's your intention going into it? What's your mindset? How do you feel in your body? What do you expect out of the experience? And then where are you? Who are you with? What are you doing? These really structure it. And that's why, you hear these horror stories of people, going crazy or walking into traffic or doing something stupid. It's like they did it, 99% sure they did it without the right preparation, without knowing what they're getting themselves into. And they had the kind of experience that, they deserved by not taking it seriously. And I think, scientific studies and, of course, thousands of anecdotal reports have showed us that when done with the proper intention and the mindset and the right setting, you can have these very transformative experiences that give you deep insight into your past, into your patterns, into your relationships, into your life vision, and help you provide an opportunity for you to make lasting changes in a positive way. And I think, the fact that you can't necessarily do that with heroin or cocaine or alcohol. They may have, like, alcohol might have its role in social context, whatever, but I mean, you're not going to go into it to have a deep, insightful experience, right?
Right.
I think psychedelics scare people because they make you face all that shit that you've been pushing away that you don't want to face, and people aren't ready for that, and that's fair. But the people who are ready for that, it's a huge opportunity to go deep and have an honest, authentic talk with yourself and figure your stuff out and face those demons, right?
I love that, having an honest conversation with yourself. And for the people who are ready to do that, they should have the access and the ability to do so, And you brought up an interesting point about just harm reduction, and education about these compounds. Like they're really powerful. At the end of the day, they're amoral, like they're not good or bad, but they're for sure powerful, And so the need for education and using them in a safe setting and using them in a way that, you know what to expect, to the best of your ability. That's the other thing I want to talk about is you can never really know, unlike cocaine or alcohol or these other drugs, the point of why we take them is because we know what, why people that use them do is because they know what to expect. You know what to expect when you have a drink. You know how it's going to make you feel. You don't know for sure how you're going to feel after taking 3.5 grams of some really potent mushrooms. You could feel really good. Yeah. You probably will at some parts of the experience. There could definitely be parts of the experience that are mortifying and terrifying. And that's just part of the unpredictability of these
sometimes
compounds.
That's what you need.
Right. And that's the thing, it's stepping into the unknown. That's what people are afraid of, There's nothing unknown about having a drink, or, well, maybe for some people there's really bad consequences, that are unknown. But even then they kind of know that this is probably what's going to happen, and that's the really interesting divide between psychedelic drugs and other drugs, is that it's not predictable, it's not consistent, and that's good. That's, I think, good. It's important for us to lean into fear a little bit, and lean into the unknown, because if nothing changes, then nothing changes, right? So, like, that's what these are. They're just really powerful inducers of catalysts of change. I think that's really fascinating. Hopefully, I think I want to talk a little bit about the work you're doing as a psychedelic scientist, because I think it's totally in alignment, with bringing this information out of, the ivory tower of academia, that we're both very familiar with, and bringing it to the masses, in a way that's accessible and also entertaining, but educational and empowering. So please share a little bit about that.
Yeah. Thanks, man. Yeah, it's called the Psychedelic Scientist. It's a YouTube channel I started back in June, And with the intention of, this is a way I could share this world of psychedelic research in a way to the general public that's not like some kind of sensationalist news reporting and, trying to hype up the findings, or it's really being super superficial to the extent that you're not even capturing what the studies actually said. And so I started this thing. Really, it's a way for me to share this world, and also a way for me to kind of share my have a record or a log of my own process of learning these things and going through the science and how the research develops over time. And I think a lot of people are interested in this stuff, obviously, and want to know more, and are limited in their ability to go and get it because they can, a lot of people just can't go and read the primary sources, the actual research articles. And I made it into video form because I feel like people have very little attention spans these days, and it's hard getting people to read stuff. And so having some kind of engaging format of conveying it, I thought would be the most effective way. And so I'm just continuing to push forward with that, and just finding different interesting ways to present the science and show people the limitations of it, as well as showing the cool stuff that we're finding. And and it's been exciting so far, and I'm planning to continue that for the foreseeable future.
Dude, that's really awesome. I definitely am in alignment with all of that, with the work we're doing at Microdose and creating psychedelic science media, basically, for the general education of everybody, so people can get plugged in and tapped in, tuned in, turned on to all of the exciting work that's happening in this space, So I think it's been a really great conversation. I really appreciate you coming on the show. If you could share your handles and your, where people can find out about the Psychedelic Scientist and you, I think that'd be really helpful for our listeners.
For sure, thank you. And first, awesome to be here. I really enjoyed this. And so you can find me on Twitter at mgirnneuro, so MGIRNNEURO, and then also on Instagram and YouTube. It's just on Instagram, it's at the Psychedelic Scientist. YouTube is just Google the Psychedelic Scientist, or YouTube search the Psychedelic Scientist. You can go find me. So those are the main two ways. And if you ever want to contact me, you could just DM me on Twitter, or you could find my email pretty easy on the internet too, I think. So.
Awesome, dude. I think there are a lot more exciting conversations to be had between us. I look forward to having you on the show again next time, And are there any last minute thoughts that you had? I'd love to give you the last word.
Yeah, for sure. Let me think. Is there anything I want to say? I think just in general, just keep an eye out for all the cool stuff that's coming, and realize that these are truly mysterious and powerful compounds that have a lot of potential, but we really don't know that much about them. And there's so much more research that needs to be done in various fields, not just neuroscience, psychology, and psychiatry, but also anthropology, sociology, and kind of fully fleshing out these fascinating compounds, which have this huge sensitivity to, what's already going on, because they're amplifiers, right? So I think there's just so much interesting stuff to come, and always just be cognizant of their huge potential, and always come at them with respect and recognize that they can be used to help people, and they're extremely effective at helping facilitate a process. Comes down to intention and people's ability to work through their deepest wounds and their darkest demons, and that's it. It's super exciting.
That's a great message. Well, thank you so much, Manesh. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everybody. This has been the third episode of the PsyFi podcast. We were here with the Psychedelic Scientist, Manesh Girn, and thank you so much, and we look forward to chatting with you next time. Yeah,
thanks so much.
Thanks for joining the Psy-Fi series, brought to you by Microdose and the Conscious Fund. Visit our website at www.microdose.buzz.